Hello, everybody. Last time we talked about how to put together a basic HTML web page, and I also recorded a video showing you how to upload it to GitHub to start a GitHub repository, um, clone it, synchronize it with your local clone, how to make sure that you enable this up and down workflow with GitHub, and also how to publish your HTML files on the publishing system called GitHub Pages, right? So this is where we left things off, more or less, right? So we have a header, we have a footer. We have some paragraph with a link, and then we have a couple of images, right? For the sake of reminding you about the workflow, I will start by going to GitHub Desktop, right? This is my repository. And I'm going to start by fetching the origin, right? This is just a good practice to make sure that maybe you contributed some changes from some other computer, or maybe you have another clone of your repository on another computer. So just making sure that whatever you have in your local clone is synchronized. Okay, so we're just going to fetch. There we go. Then we can open our repository in Visual Studio Code, right? Because that's going to be our main coding tool. So I already have it open, so we might as well just start from here. Okay, so this is the HTML file. This is kind of where we left it off, right? Maybe there was some meta information that we wanted to add here, or that we added here, or something that's not particularly important, right? So today the conversation is going to be about CSS. So if you remember, last time I dropped in a link for you guys to my Mozilla Developer Network, kind of the documentation portal that hosts all the documents about all the web-related technologies, right? So if you go to that page, right here, so I kind of directed you towards HTML component, right, of that page, HTML part, which talks about how to structure the web. And we are going to move on to the next section, to CSS, how to style the web, right? So CSS stands for Cascading Style Sheets. If you scroll up a little bit, you will see this abbreviation. And it's the technology that you should start learning right after HTML. And basically, CSS allows you to alter the way your web page looks. Okay, and that means a lot of things, right? So fundamentally, at least for our kind of main purpose, um, it will mean that CSS allows you to change things like fonts and colors and font sizes and stuff like this, right? So basically, like the sort of like fundamental visual properties of the components on your page, right? Adding color, adding background color, and so on and so forth. And then the other part of it is that CSS also takes care of layout. And it's sort of least understood. Well, yeah, I wouldn't say least understood. It's a fairly well understood part, but like people don't usually think about CSS as a layout tool, but I think that first and foremost it is a layout tool, and it its main power is fundamentally in how it allows you to lay out the pages, right? So we will look at one very specific layout strategy today that is, again, very powerful and virtually ubiquitous. It's called responsive layout, right? So responsive layout, or responsive design, if you might have heard that term, is basically a feature in CSS that allows you to keep the content of the page the same, but change the way that content is laid out on the page depending on the size of the screen, right? So primarily that came to power with the advent of mobile devices, right? So if you have something small like a phone, it will give you one size. Then you have something medium size, maybe like a tablet, it will give you more real estate on the screen, right? And then if you have a computer, laptop, desktop, whatever, biggest screen, right? So you have a lot more real estate. And therefore, the constraints and the opportunities in the visual design and the layout of your page will be quite different from one size to the next, right? And so CSS developed kind of like a tool set to allow you to reflow your page, right? Change its layout depending on the screen size. So we're going to be looking at it in more details today, and we're also going to kind of look at some of the additional features that it has, you know, things like altering font, color, size, spacing, and so on and so on, right? Animations and decorative features. We're probably not going to look into animations in CSS, but this definitely is something that you can do, and definitely something that you are very welcome to look into a little further in this CSS documentation. Okay. All right. So let's start. Let's start making things, right? Let's first talk about how the content on our page, the HTML content, will be referenced from CSS, right? So there are three ways to write CSS, and the first one, the one you should very, very rarely use, there's only one really good use case for that specific way of writing CSS, is to just add it as an attribute to your components, right? So we have an image here, for example. Let's just zoom in a little bit, right? So we have an image, and it has two attributes. It has a source and it has an alt. We have an anchor, right? And it has an href, and it has a target, right? So those are attributes over your HTML documents. And so if you wanted to add some kind of styling to them, you can add a style attribute, right? And you can add a CSS property and the value of that property in the style. So for example, if I wanted to make my header change its color, so for example, I would then say color and then switch it to let's say green, right? So I'm gonna there's a few built-in colors. There are 255 actually built-in colors in the CSS standard, and you can address them in plain language, right? So there are many ways to specify color in CSS. One would be in RGB, right? Hopefully a familiar concept to you, red, green, and blue components. So I can say something like 120 on the red, and then 200 on the green, and then 120 on the blue, right? This should be a comma, right? So they're comma separated. So this is going to give me like a relatively light or like medium light green, right? You can also use a hash notation, also RGB system, red, green, blue, right? So it's a hash, right? And then it's going to go between 0, 0 to FF, right? So the range is always 255. It's just represented in a different notation. So if you use RGB notation, it will be in decimals. And if you use a hashtag notation, it's going to be in hexadecimal. So between zeros and F. So again, if you want to learn more about the notations and how it all came to be, so very interesting. Highly recommend that you look it up, but it's still a little bit outside of the scope of this conversation. But if I wanted to achieve a similar color, I would probably go with something like AA, EF, AA, right? It will probably give me a similar game, maybe a little bit lighter, right? But generally, the first two letters will stand for the red, the next one for the green, and the next two will be blue. You can also use other systems like HSL, hue, saturation, and lightness, a different color system altogether, or you can use the pre-built color names like light green. Okay, so one way or another, we can specify the color of our header and save this page, right? And then we can go back to our index.html, save the page, reload, and we see that the color has changed. Not that it's a very good aesthetic choice, but it's just for the demonstration purposes, right? So one of the biggest problems with that is that there are often going to be cases where you want to repeat your style. So for example, maybe all of my headers will want to take on a particular color or particular font size or a particular font style, and so on and so forth. And my page might be long. And so instead of going and literally copying and pasting same thing over and over and over again, um, we have other strategies. We can address our elements directly from our style sheets. And so there are two ways to create style sheets. One would be to create them directly in the HTML document under a style tag, right? So this time it's not just an attribute of another tag, it's a style tag. So if I wanted to address my H1 element, I would just put an H1 and then again, color. And then maybe this time we'll find something like light blue, right? Instead of light green. Okay, so if we save this, it will work just as well. Now the color changed, but the concept it remains the same. But what that means is that I can also address other headers on the page. And CSS addressing is a big topic of conversation. But if I wanted to select several different elements, I could separate them with a comma, right? I can say H1 and also H2. Remember, we have H1, H2, and so on, and also paragraph, right? So those three elements, anything belonging to those elements would take on the blue color. So if I save this, right, and I go back to my page, now everything, my header and my paragraph became blue, okay? So you probably noticed that the anchor didn't become blue. And this takes us to another important thing um, about CSS. Some of the styles will translate to the child elements, to the children of a particular element. So, and this is where we have to kind of get into the idea of children and parents. So we can consider this anchor to be a child of paragraph because it's included in the paragraph. I think it's a little bit easier to illustrate if we go into the inspector panel, and if we open up the paragraph, we see that there is a child sitting inside it, right? So we can say that anchor is a child of a paragraph and a grandchild of a body, right? And so body has 4 children, H1, paragraph, image, and then another image, right? And the common ancestor of all of those elements is HTML, right? So basically traverse up and down the ancestral tree that way. So whatever is included inside an element is considered to be a child of that element, and whatever contains a certain element is a parent, right? And you can go and figure out your lines of descendants and ancestors that way. So the important point here is that anchor does not inherit color from the paragraph, right? Anchor sets its own color, right? Maybe I could also set my color differently. Maybe I could say something like body, right? So I will apply to the body of the element, the body of my page, right? So everything inside the body will take color light blue, right? So if I save this and reload the page, you will see that the effect is essentially the same. H1 and paragraph are blue, so they inherited this color from the body, but the anchor didn't, right? So again, this is something that differs from element to element and from property to property, right? So maybe if we add another property, for example, font family. So let's switch our font family to be Arial, Helvetica, or sans serif, right? I will explain in just a second why we're picking 3 members of that family, or 2 or more than 1 basically. But if we pick a font family and reload, right, you'll see that Anchor actually inherits the font family, but it doesn't inherit the color. So it has to do with how explicitly the CSS is written and pre-written, right? So obviously, like, even if we don't have any CSS on the page, if I take this out and delete it and save the page, we still have some style. So there are some styles on the page that come with the browser, that the browser supplies for us. And so one of them is explicitly setting the color for the anchor. So if we wanted to overwrite that explicit setting, we would have to address that anchor specifically, right? So that has to do with the specificity of addressing. It's kind of like another feature of CSS. I don't want to get into too small and too minute details because then our video is going to get really, really long. But instead, I wanted to first look at how to set the font family parameters. So we said Arial, Helvetica, and sans serif. So what that means is that we are providing levels of backup. So we're going to say, if you have Arial on your computer, right, whoever is loading your page, right, whichever computer is loading your page, if there is an Arial font on that computer or available to that computer, then load Arial. If you don't have Arial, look for Helvetica. Maybe you have Helvetica, and if you have Helvetica, that would be an acceptable substitution, right? And then if you don't have Arial or Helvetica, then just give me any sans serif font that you might have available, right? So this is why we're setting up the font family like this. Okay, so some properties have very specific ways of how they can be written, and some of the features available to them that might not be available to others. Like I can't specify two different colors. I can't say light blue and then also light green, right? That's just going to be nonsense because there's no point. Like there's always a blue color if there is a green color, right? So, and it's, if you look inside your inspector, you will notice that now when I'm pointing to say a paragraph, right, and I'm looking at its styles, right, so down below you will have the styles section, right, the color property will be crossed off, and there's going to be a warning sign here because it's an invalid property value. You cannot set two colors for the style, right? But you can set two different fonts, or three or four or five or however many, and they will just be considered backup, right? So in this case, Firefox Inspector Panel is showing me that I do have Arial on my computer, and so it's loading the font of my first choice. So therefore, it's there is an underscore under Arial, right? If the Arial was missing, it would go on to Helvetica, and then Helvetica would be underscored, and so on. Okay. All right. So, great. So we started looking at some of the properties, and let's go back to writing our color correctly. We'll probably switch that to something a little bit more palatable. Maybe we'll set it to be like 222, 2, right? So something like very, very dark gray. That would be acceptable font color. Now it's loading properly, and then in the browser you might even be able to open the color picker and see how that what exactly that color is. Okay. All right, so great. So the only problem with that is that CSS tends to run long, especially if you consider what we talked about a little earlier about the fact that we want to start adding responsive layouts to our cascading style sheets. And responsive layouts will basically substitute some styles with other styles, and it's just going to keep growing and growing and growing, and you have originals and substitutions for substitutions, so it can grow big, right? And then if you have CSS in the file and HTML in the same file, then the file starts getting very unruly, okay? So in order to overcome this, there is another strategy. We can take all the CSS and place it in its own separate file, right? And this is how it's commonly done, okay? So let's look at how we can do that. So I'm going to remove this. We're going to rewrite this a little bit in a minute. And instead, so I'm going to do what my suggestion is telling me to do. So I'm going to say link, right? So I'm going to link a document here, and the relationship of that link is going to be style sheet. Okay. All right. So this is how it will be written. So it will be style sheet, right? And then the type of content that I'm loading is going to be text slash CSS. What type of text is going to be CSS? And then the href, the reference to that link, is going to be the document called style.css. So if I load this now, it's not going to load because I don't have a file called style.css, right? So I need to create that file, style.css, right? And just like with the images, just like with loading of the images, the traversing of the structure still applies. So I say style.css without any prefixes because it's on the same level in the same folder as my index file. So I'm going from index in the same folder. I'm going to be finding style.css. If I had like a separate folder that would contain all of my style sheets, which is not uncommon for a large and complicated website, I might first have to say, like, if the folder is called, for example, styles slash style.css. But I'm gonna keep things simple for the sake of demonstration. So we're linking to the style.css. Here's the file. It's empty right now, right? So the way you typically work with CSS and HTML, you kind of like, you look at the element, you apply styles to it. You look at another element or a group of elements and you apply styles to it. So it's a kind of like a back and forth. So in order to facilitate this back and forth, Visual Studio Code allows you to do a split screen, right? So if I were to take my CSS and split the screen, you will put it right here. So I can close it on this side and instead start looking at it on the other side of my screen. So this way I have HTML over here and I'll be writing my CSS over here. Okay, so what are we gonna say? So we are gonna try and write a responsive layout first and foremost, and we're gonna add in other features as we go along. So responsive layout means that it's going to work on small screens and medium screens and large screens. So it's gonna change, but that change is going to be intentional and it's going to be specified by us how it's going to change. So the kind of like rule of thumb of responsive layout is designing for small screens first. So you start as a default view of your screen of your website. You always start with a small screen, phone, mobile phone, for in most cases, right? And then you change that layout as your intended screen grows larger, right? So maybe we'll do something like this. We'll have one layout for a mobile phone, a slightly different layout for a tablet, and a slightly different layout again for a larger screen like a laptop or a desktop. Okay, so in order to facilitate this work, we're gonna need to see what the site looks like on the phone. And so there are tools that allow us to do this within the browser. Okay, so on Firefox, it will be located here, called responsive design mode, right? So you can click on it here. I believe if you're on Chrome, it's going to be like right next to this selector button. This selector allows you to like pick an element on the page and point to it, right? But if you engage the responsive design mode, it allows you to look at your website the way it would be seen on a particular device. So right now I'm looking at an iPad running iPad OS 14.7.1 and Safari 14.1, right? So I can also change the orientation. Right now it's in portrait. I can change it to tablet. I can also change the device. So let's start with a reasonably generic mobile phone, like maybe something like iPhone 13 Pro, right? iOS 14.6. seems reasonably generic to me, right? So here we go. This is what the website would look like, right? And it's not a bad idea to just kind of reload it. So by default, the page is zoomed in, right? It's not a bad idea if you don't have this included in your head. It's not a bad idea to include a viewport meta tag. So meta, well, charset is a good addition, right? And then meta name equals viewport, right? And then oops, viewport, and here's my helper suggesting the content, right? So this will specify that I want to use the width of the device, right? Whether it's a phone or a browser or whatever it is that I'm using to look at the website, and the initial scale will be 1, right? So it doesn't need to be zoomed in or zoomed out. So that way, if I look at it, it's actually not going to be zoomed in or zoomed out, and it's so right now, our website is looking like this on this particular device, right? Our images are kind of spilling out. Our text is actually reflowing automatically, right? And if I were to kind of like change the dimensions, you will see that the text actually follows the width. Ooh, what happened? The text actually follows the width. The images stay the same. So some of the elements are naturally responsive by default. The images might not be one of those elements. And so it's not a bad idea to be a little bit more intentional about it than we are. So let's start from the start. Let's look at the body. So the body by default has this 8 pixel margin around it. And so I would suggest let's remove it, right? So the way I know it is, well, because I remember, but really, if you select the body and if you look at the layout tab in your style sheets or in your style helper on the web inspector in the browser, you will look at the box model, right? So we kind of talked a little bit briefly about the idea that it's all like boxes inside boxes inside boxes, right? Like you have each one of the elements is just like a box that sits next to another box or contains some boxes inside it. And so that's the box model. So every box, meaning every element, will have certain components to it. It will be a margin, right? The margin is the space around the box. Border, right, which will be like the border that you can add. So right now our border is 0, but we can add borders to it. Padding is the space inside the element. So if I say that my element has to be 100 pixels wide, and then the padding on the left and the padding on the right will have to be 10 pixels, those 10 and 10, right, so 20, will be taken out of that 100. So I'm going to have 80 pixels left for the content itself, right? So margin is on the outside, padding is on the inside of the element. And then the content, right? So this is what you can use this in order to kind of find out how that box model is working on various elements. So for example, we see that the headers have by default some margins and the paragraphs by default have some margins, but images, for example, do not, right? So so it might be helpful to kind of keep an eye on it at the very least, right? And then over here on this side, we will be seeing the properties and some of the properties that the element inherits from other elements, its ancestors, one way or another, okay? All right, so let's remove the padding around our body and let's make sure that our images never spill out. So we can address our body the way we saw it being addressed. So just body, and then say padding. And so if you see that the helper offers me padding top, padding bottom, padding right, there's padding left, and there are other types of padding, right? And so those will allow you to set the padding of the element to different values on different sides. Or if I just say padding in general, it will set all the paddings to the same value, which is working for me because I simply need it to be 0. And don't honestly, it doesn't matter 0 of what, of pixels or points or inches or whatever unit of measurement you're using. 0 is always 0. So you don't need to specify the unit of measurement here, whereas in most other cases you will have to specify the unit of measurement. Okay. All right, so body padding 0, and then we're gonna say image, and the image maximum width of our image is going to be 100%. And 100% of what? It's always 100% of its parent, right? So it's always constrained in width by the parent. So if our image has a maximum width of 100%, it's going to be whatever is the 100% of the body. Okay. So let's save this, reload this page, and now we have a slightly different outcome. So first of all, big mistake. I meant to remove the margin, but I actually removed the padding. It's okay, and we can change that. But the images actually took on the intended effect, and they're now no more than 100% of the containing element, which is the body. All right, so let's fix that that error. I wanted to remove margin. Okay, let's save this. All right, so now we have our content very uncomfortably touching the edges of our screen, which is something that we will address in just a little bit. So for now, let's just leave it like this. We're kind of setting the stage for ourselves. Also, I don't think it's a bad idea for us to just bring back some of those styles that we have written earlier. So maybe our font family is, in fact, going to be Arial, right? Arial, Helvetica Sans Serif, something like this. And then we can also change the color, right? Color. And set it to 222222, right? So dark gray. And then we can also change the background color of the body. And this is, those are two properties that are often being confused. Color sets the color of the type of the font on text on your page, and the background color sets the color of the background naturally, right? So let's make it I don't know, F0, 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 something like this, light gray. So let's look back at the page. Very nice. We have a sans serif, and we have a light gray background with a dark gray text on it. Okay, so we can also set the width of our images to 100. So obviously the difference is that max width wouldn't allow them to get bigger than their parent, but they can potentially get smaller. In this case, for my purpose, I want all the images to be exactly the same as the container, right? Because I want this like nice column-like stacked flow of my page, because this is fairly typical for mobile devices, and I want to kind of like meet my users' expectation. Okay. All right, so moving on, let's look at one common element that changes often its appearance between devices, right? From mobile to, let's say, medium screen like tablets to larger screen, and that is a navigation bar. So right now we don't have a navigation bar. So let's include a navigation bar into our HTML structure and see how we can use a responsive strategy in order to style it. All right, so what I'm gonna do, I'm going to include three main components into the body of my document. I'm gonna include a header, right? So that's gonna be the header of my document. All right, so I have a suggestion. I don't need an H1 in there, but I do want a nav and the UL, but I want to actually write this out and talk through this. But this is a relatively handy suggestion. So I'm going to, so the header I would want to point out is very different from the head. Head is the element that describes the page. Nothing that you put on the head shows up on the page, whereas the header is a typical sort of like newspaper magazine style header that you can put at the top of your page, right? And then below the header, I'm going to have main content, right? So it's just main element. And again, you can look up what those elements are and what elements are available to you. You have things like header and main, and I'm going to also add a footer, right? So like I'm going to add a footer element, and it's offering me to add my my first web page with a copyright, and it's obviously going to be 2024, not 2021, but sure. So we have header and main and footer and aside and section and all kinds of other sort of like big structural options. So one of the things that commonly goes into the header would be a navigation bar, and the HTML tag is nav. So we have a nav, and navigation is typically represented as a list. And it's typically an unordered list, meaning like it doesn't have 1, 2, 3. It has it doesn't have like numbering in it. So we use a UL, stands for unordered list, tag in order to represent it, right? So we have a UL, and a UL would have list items in it, so LI, right? And as a navigation bar, since this is a navigation bar, every list item would be a link to something. Could be a link to another page. For example, you might have a website with like a home page, an about page, and a contact page. So you would then have anchor with an H reference to, let's say, home.html, or well, home typically is index.html, right? Index.html. And then we'll call it home, right? And then we can take this and index, make a spelling mistake. And then we can take the same line, copy and paste it below, and then add this about.html, and this is going to be our about page. We don't have it yet, but it's okay. We can still link to it and create it later, right? And then we have, well, there you go. We have a contact page, right? So we have index, about, and contact links in our navigation, and it's all structured as an unordered list with list items. Okay, fantastic. So time to take a look at what that whole thing looks like on the page. All right, not exactly what I was hoping for, but this is where we can use CSS in order to start kind of like overriding some of the default properties, right? So let's point to one of those elements and take a look at what we have here, right? So unordered list, for example. So it seems like it already has a padding and it already has margins, and I'm not sure if that's something that I really need. But also I might be hesitant to remove something like this from all unordered lists, right? What if I need another unordered list somewhere further down in my text? So this is where we go back to CSS addressing. And so one of the ways to address elements, in addition to the way we saw it before, right, where we said like h1, comma, h2, comma, maybe h3, h4, 5, h5, h6, and so on, right? One of the ways to address elements could be to address a specific element based on what kind of ancestry it has, right? So I might say that I want to just target the unordered list that is located inside the nav, that's located inside the header, right? So its ancestry line would be something like header, nav, ul, right? So it's an unordered list that is a descendant of the nav, and then the nav itself is a descendant of the header, right? It doesn't have to be a direct child. You have a slightly different way of addressing for direct children. You would add something like this for it to be a direct child, but I don't care. Maybe that UL also sits inside another component, but that's unimportant. The important thing is that I want to address the the unordered list that has a nav as its ancestor, and that nav will also have a header as its ancestor. Okay, so that's going to give me a decent enough specificity. So first of all, I want to get rid of those uh, bullet symbols right in front of my list items. I also want to remove that built-in padding, and I want to remove that built-in margin, right? So let's do that. To remove the bullets, I will set the list style to none, right? I don't want anything to style my list. I will also set padding, and we can set the padding to be 0 on all sides, just like we did with the body, before we realized that we actually needed to set the margin on all sides for the body. We can also set the margins to be 0 on all sides for the UL, right? And then I think that for now at least concludes the list of things I wanted to do with my UL, right? So let's save this. And then take a look at it. All right, that's something not particularly great, but it's okay. So a couple of things I would want to change here. I would want to change the background color, right? I want to separate visually my navigation list from my the rest of my page, right? And maybe I'll apply the color to the navigation overall, right? I want all the navigation, whether it's a UL or maybe I'll have some other components in my navigation. I want all of it to be to have a different background color, right? So I'm gonna have header, nav, and then I'm gonna set the background color to be, oh, I don't know, bisque. Don't know why. I just picked one at random. And then I also want to make sure that the font size of my text is a little bit larger in there. And so maybe again, there are many decisions that you will have to make that don't have any like specific rule. Oh, you have to do it this way or have to do it this way. It kind of like you just eyeball a lot of things. So maybe I will set my font size for my UL items here on the UL level, right? Because what if I want something on the nav that's going to be a different font size? Possible, right? So I'm going to set font size. So it's font dash size. And so I'm going to have an 8 pixel based design system. So let's do 32 pixels. Right, 8 times 4. So, okay. Good, good, good. It's getting closer, but I feel that these elements are very close to each other. And also, I don't like the fact that they have underlines, and I don't like the fact that they're different color. So let's fix a couple of things, right? Maybe I'll switch the font size to be 24. A little bit smaller. Yeah, perfect. So I can start kind of navigating and pointing to the elements and seeing like what can I do here, right? So one thing that I can maybe do is what if I add a little bit of padding for my list items so that I would have, let's say, 16 here, 16 here, 16 here, and 16 here, right? So this is what the list item would look like with 16 pixels of padding. And then the next one would also have 16 pixels and the next one, right? If you do it here in the browser while you're sort of like looking and eyeballing something, it will add it at the element level, right? Remember how we did it the first time, just adding a style tag and then just setting all of the parameters within that style tag. Not the most efficient way, but there are other ways to set it. But fundamentally, right, you playing around with it in the browser is not going to save it. So if I reload this page, it's all gone, right? If you want to save this, it has to be written in your actual style sheet in your CSS document. So I'm going to set this to be header nav ul li. Again, I'm looking for a list item who has an ancestor that is a that is an unordered list, and then I have a um, that unordered list has an ancestor as a navigation, and that navigation has an ancestor of a header, right? So it kind of like, this is what it shows you, like this highlight of how I want that structure to look like, right? You want a li inside a ul, inside a nav, inside a header, right? All right, great. So I want the padding, and again, let's do it the same on all sides, of 16 pixels around my elements. So CSS can be very unforgiving, by the way, with semicolons. So if you're going to forget to put a semicolon after a property, your CSS will very possibly break, right? So please pay attention that every line in CSS has to end with a semicolon. All right, great. Much better. So but I haven't gotten rid of the color um, of my links over here, and I haven't gotten rid of those weird underlines, right? So if you remember in the beginning when we talked about the fact that the anchor right here doesn't comply with the rules that I set for the entire body, right? Because the way it's set is specified at the level of the anchor. So we have to address the anchor directly. So we have to actually point to the anchor and say, like, it's the anchor inside the li, inside the ul, inside the nav. And again, how you're going to write that specificity is more or less up to you, but maybe we're going to say something like this: header ul a, right? So any anchor inside ul, whether it's inside an li or not, right? And any ul inside a header, whether it's inside a nav or not. But for us, it's kind of getting tiresome to create like this very specific addresses or select CSS selectors for something that might never happen, right? And so we can say like header ul li, and so that underline under the anchor is called text decoration. So let's set text decoration to none, and then let's set color to our regular text color, right? So color is going to be, if you remember, that's going to be 222222. And let's not forget the semicolon. Save this. Let's double check. All right. So maybe in this view, I will also set the list items to, first of all, have text aligned to the center. So text align, column center, semicolon. And then maybe they will also have a border, but only on the bottom, right? So border bottom, and then you can specify, like, in order to create a border, you need several parameters. You need to give it a thickness, right? So let's do 1 pixel. And then you need to give it a style, border style. And for us, it's just going to be basic solid border. And then the color might be black, right? Just 0000000. Okay, just simple black border on the bottom. So let's save this. Again, go back to the page, reload, we can take a look at it. Not bad. So the only thing that kind of bothers me a little bit, maybe this border on the bottom is not necessary, right? Just we already have a color separation between the main component or the main section and the header with the navigation. So we can, what if we could remove the border, the bottom border, just on the last element, right? And yes, we can. And so there are tons and tons of ways to address different CSS elements differently. So you can go to the CSS selector section in the CSS documents, right? And they kind of go into like the details and the types of selectors, and we've already seen some of them. And so the one that we're looking at right now is going to be called a pseudo class. So a pseudo class identifies an element that belongs to a special category just by the virtue of what it is, where it is, and how it is, right? So in this case, we have a pseudo class called last child. So basically, what that means is that this list item is the last child of our UL, right? So the first one is this one, the home. The second one is about, and then the last one is going to be the contact, right? So if we wanted to remove the border on this last element, we can address it just as header, let's say ul li last child, okay? And then we can set the bottom border of that last child to be none, okay? So that allows us to remove the border from here. Okay, great. So all of this is good, great, and fantastic. Now we need to start thinking about what that whole thing is going to look like when the page gets larger, right? So if I start extending the width of my page, you can start seeing that it's actually starting to get uncomfortably wide and maybe just about at the size of, let's say, iPad. Or better yet, there's, if I edit the list and add one more device here, you can add an iPad mini, right? So I just know from experience that if I switch to an iPad mini, right, it's kind of like the smallest iPad that's available. It's more or less the smallest tablet that's available. So that's where it's going to be quite uncomfortable, right? So you can use, I tip it again, you can use any size you like, but I typically use iPad mini as my switch point between the phone view, small view, and the mobile view, and the tablet view for the mobile devices. And so you can note the width of an iPad mini, it's 768. But let's go back first to an iPhone view and set up some of the properties that will help us in laying things out properly. So our unordered list, right, this one, we need to set a property of display to be flex. So flex display is a specific layout strategy that has been created that allows us to create responsive websites. So you can find out more about how flex and Flexbox as a layout strategy, that's what it's called, Flexbox, works from this article. This is kind of a standard on a website called CSS Tricks. And so they have an explanation of like why it became this way and kind of like how it works under the hood. And so what are some of the properties? And the first and foremost thing that you need to do is you need to set your container, the unordered list, right? This list that we're trying to modify, to have a display property of flex. And so this strategy hinges on the relationship between the container, right? So you can imagine this purple box being the container and the items inside the container being the children, okay? So Flex also has a flex direction, which allows you to lay out your elements either vertically or horizontally, right? And so the terminology would be flex direction either row or column. And so by default, again, remember, we're looking at small mobile screens by default. Our flex direction is going to be column. Okay, so we added this. If we head over back to our page, not much has changed. The only thing you might notice that UL will have this little flex indicator next to it, right? This element behaves like a block element and lays out its content according to the Flexbox model. That's what it means, okay? So, but what this allows us to do, it allows us to change the way the elements are laid out under different circumstances. And so the circumstances that we're looking at is when we're, for example, looking at the screen that's 768 pixels or potentially even larger than that, right? So this is you probably won't find a device with 666 pixels width on it, right? But like at the top, right here, you can see the number that I'm setting it. But once we get to 768, right? That's our, come on, that's our iPad mini, right? That's already too wide for it to be vertical. We definitely want to switch it to horizontal, right? So let's set this to be iPad mini and set the, and figure out how to set the flex direction to horizontal. So first we need to specify this transition point, 768 pixels. So typically I do it in different, like every screen size will have its own chunk in the CSS document, right? And maybe I'll even add like a little comment, tablet size screens like this, and then we can remove that and then comment this out. If you want to comment out the entire line just the way I did, it's going to be either command / on Mac, or it's going to be control / on Windows, right? And then I will add what's known as media query, right? So you will type at media, and then minimum width is equal to 768 pixels. Okay. So, and then you put the curly brackets, and then all the styles for that screen size and above, because again, notice that we're saying minimum width 768 pixels, right? So anything above is fine, right? So all the styles that we specify between these two curly brackets will be changed, okay? So in this case, we want to specifically change the property flex direction of our header nav UL. So you do want to address them the same way they were addressed in your default styles. So you can even just copy and paste this line, right? That's addressing the element, and paste this in, and then put in flex direction to be row. Okay. So now what that means is if I go to my page and I reload it, now I have all of my elements laid out horizontally, right? So if I make it smaller, they're vertical. If I make it larger than 768, they become horizontal. That's how CSS responsive model works. Okay, so clearly I don't need the borders on the bottom, right? I can easily remove the border bottom. And again, if you set the border bottom to an element here like this, you would have to remove it the same way. So I would go, and after my UL styles, I'm gonna add this, and yes, border bottom set to none, right? So there we go. And then another property that I can set is I can distribute my elements, right? My li elements inside my flex container, the flex parent, differently, right? And I would do this as with a property called justify content. Justify content. And so here's some of the options. You can center it. You can set it at the end. You can set it on the left. You can set it on the right. So right and end in our case is the same, simply because we're working in the left to right language, right? English is a left to right language. That's what sets the direction for your flex containers. We have space around, where the same amount of space on the left of the element and on the right of the element will be applied. Same here on the left and on the right, on the left and on the right. And then we have space between, where the space between the pairs of elements will be the same. And then you have space evenly, where you're going to have the same amount here, the same amount here, the same amount here, and the same amount of space here. So space evenly looks pretty good to me. Let's leave it like this. Right, so justify content will be set to space evenly. Okay. All right. So again, we're going to be switching from viewing our page like this to viewing our page like that. Okay, and you can see how this can be taken even further. So for example, what if I wanted to look at the screen that's even larger? And again, those cutoff points are kind of up to you, more or less, right? But you can imagine that somewhere like around here, it's starting to get pretty large. I tend to use 960 as the next cutoff point. I've seen people use 1,000. I've seen people use other values. So there's no, again, there's no strict rule, or there's like not a scientific way to figure it out. But let's go with desktop size screens, right? Desktop size screens will be set at media. And then, so it's offering me to set the media to 1024. I'm going to disagree and set the minimum width of my screen to 960. Again, for no reason than just a habit. Okay. And then I can say that maybe on this screen, I will have my content be all gathered on the left, right? I can say that like my header nav UL, the justify content will switch to flex end or just end. Both those properties mean the same thing. Okay, so I'm not going to change the flex direction. I'm only going to change the justify content, right? So if I do this, here they are at the end. So that tells you one thing, that flex direction, unless it's explicitly overwritten, will continue to apply, right? Justify content will stop applying space evenly property because it is explicitly overwritten with another property at the following point. That's kind of how the model works. It will take whatever property you specified for the smaller screens and will keep applying it unless you say, oh, at this size, explicitly overwrite this property or explicitly overwrite this property with that value that I am providing for this size. Okay. All right. So that's that. And then that gives us a decent sort of idea of how flex layout strategy works and responsive layout strategy by default. There is another kind of complementary layout strategy called CSS grid, right? So this is CSS grid layout guide. It's a little bit more complicated than flex. Actually, it's significantly more complicated than flex. It's also more powerful, but because it is quite a bit more complicated, a lot of CSS design systems, even professional, like fully implemented design systems for very large websites, tend to shy away from the grid. They tend to stick with the Flexbox because Flexbox in itself is actually very powerful and will allow you to provide responsive properties fairly easily. Okay, so but feel free to take a look at CSX Flexbox guide and CSS Grid guide and see if you can, if you want to dig a little bit deeper into this topic. Right, so this is more of like an introductory / overview video of what CSS can do. I'm not digging too deep into those details, but I will definitely at some point record a series of videos about how to put together a website from the beginning to end, and we will go deeper into all of those possibilities and options. It will probably take quite a bit longer too. All right, so here we are. And one thing that you might notice that we've been focusing on the navigation bar so much, but the contents of our page are actually quite uncomfortable at this point. So the screen is wide. the images are pixelated. They're obviously pixelated because they need to be way smaller. And then this line of text is really spilling out. So let's see if we can contain our content to a certain width. This is another very common strategy. So once your page gets to a certain point, you kind of contain all the content in the center. And then if it grows larger, it just grows like grows some empty space on the sides, right? So the way to do this would be to set, let's say at the desktop size, we'll set our main element to have a fixed width. So let's say the width is going to be 960 pixels. And then the way to sort of like center it and allow the space on the sides to grow is to set the margins, specifically left and right margins, but you can also set all the margins to auto. And so here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to say 0 auto. And that is a shorthand for top and bottom is 0 and left and right is auto. Just a quick CSS shorthand. Okay, so if I do this and save, okay, so we now have the content, right? You can see how if I let's make this window larger and let's make this larger. And so now as the size grows, right, the navigation bar will grow with it, but the main content, right, the components of the main content will remain static. Okay, so this is called like a typical T design. I'm sure you've seen it plenty of times. Okay. All right. So another thing I can do is I want to make sure that my images width is set to auto, right? So that I'm not forcing them to be 100 pixels width, like I'm doing for the small size screens, right? For default, remember again, is mobile. And again, where you do it is kind of up to you. Maybe I'll do it here, and I'm going to say image, and then for the image, the width will be auto. Okay, so auto means just auto honestly means different things in different contexts, right? So here for the margins, it means whatever's on the left, so is on the right, right? So if the window grows, and so the margin on the left grows, so the margin on the right will also grow. So it will kind of like distribute the left and right margin evenly. For the image width, auto means whatever is the file, right? Whatever is the file size. If the file is 600 pixels wide, then set it to 600. If the file is 300 pixels wide, set it to 300. Okay, a little bit confusing, but you kind of start getting used to it after a while. All right, so we have that, and so once we reload, our images now should be set to their original size, non-pixelated. Okay, that's good. That's all good stuff, right? So we're kind of getting very close to where we want to be. I just wanted to point out yet another strategy for CSS addressing. So I wanted to show you how to address elements by class and by ID, right? And so class and ID are very, very common ways of addressing elements. You will see that in the styling the web section, right? Like CSS building blocks, and then it will say type, class, and ID selector, right? So type we looked at, right? So it's just whatever the element is, H1 or P or body or whatever. But there's also a way to address elements by class and a way to address elements by ID. And the main difference between a class and an ID is that a class can belong to many elements. So I can have a class called special paragraph, right? And this paragraph can belong to this, and I can have another paragraph that belongs to that class, and I have yet another paragraph that belongs to that class. Okay, so that's one. So you can have many elements that belong to a specific class, and one element, this paragraph, can have more than one class. So for example, I can have it be a special paragraph and also a blue paragraph, right? Or however I want to start naming my classes. Okay, so class and element is always a many-to-many relationship. ID is always a one-to-one relationship. An element can only have one ID, and you can only have one element that has a certain ID. Okay, so let's demonstrate this, and maybe it will be a little bit easier. So the way I'm gonna start with IDs, right? So the one-to-one relationship, and I think one great way to demonstrate the power of IDs is to show how they can also help with the page navigation, right? So far we have been working under premise that our list items are gonna link to external pages, but what if you want to do a website that has a long scroll? Right? And then if you click on about or if you click on content, it just scrolls you down to that section. Okay, so this is where IDs will be very, very useful. So let's introduce three different sections. Let's do section, right? Three different sections in my main element. So the first section is going to contain whatever I have right now, my H1, P, and 2 images. Okay, and then the next section is going to contain some information about me, right? Because this is going to be about. So I'm going to put an H2 and say something like about me, and then I'm going to put a paragraph of some text, and again lorem ipsum for now will do. Okay, and then I'm going to have one more section, and that section is going to be contact information, right? So I'm going to do H2 contact info, something like this. And then I'm going to put a paragraph and an anchor, right? So I'm going to have an anchor, and that anchor is going to be anchoring to my email. Okay, so we already saw how to anchor a link to a web page, right? So here it is, a href, and then the URL of the page, right? So I can also link to email addresses, right? So I can say href, only instead of saying HTTP and all that good stuff, I'm going to say mail to, and then the email address, right? Like mail@example.com. Okay. And so this is going to become a clickable link. So if you click on it, it will open up a email client and start writing an email to that address. And I can also add a link to right? So another anchor, and to phone numbers, right? href, only this time we're going to say telephone, tel, and then let's do +1, and then 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 0, 9. Okay, something like this. So that's the telephone number. And again, if you open this website on the phone and tap on that link, it will open up your phone application and start dialing that number. Okay, so let's save this. So we now have three sections with a little bit more content. Here we go. So here's the about me paragraph. Here's your email and your phone links. And so let's add IDs to them. So I'm going to say ID. ID is an attribute in your HTML element. I'm going to say ID home, and then ID about, and then this one is going to have an attribute called ID equals contact. Okay, so the IDs are addressed with a hashtag, right? So if I wanted to address my ID, my element with a specific ID in my HTML, right, I would write hashtag home, right? And then I would write hashtag about and add some styles. And then I would write hashtag contact. And then again, write some styles. And so maybe we can do something simple. We can change the background colors, right? So let's say the background color for my home is going to be like Alice blue, very light blue. And then the background color for about is going to be, well, it's offering me antique white. Sure, why not? Why not antique white? Right? That's like a light, like off-white beige-ish color. And then the background color, background for contact could be sure, aquamarine, why not? I don't know. It's just, again, aesthetically probably not the best choice, but for demonstration purposes, it will serve, right? So here we go. And then if we go load our page, you'll notice that the content here has this like beige off-white color. This is aquamarine, and this is light blue. Okay, so a couple of notes here. We do have a little bit of sort of situation that all the content is literally like bumping against the very edge of the section. So each section would probably benefit from a little bit of padding, right? So why not add that? So we could go and copy and paste padding and then add the padding value and then go to about and paste padding values there. But we can use what we know about classes, that we can have, we can add classes to our elements. So let's do another property and call class, right? And we'll call it main underscore section, right? That's going to be the class. So it's a section inside the main component, right? And so I can have that class be applied to all of the sections that are in the main component, right? And whereas IDs are addressed with hashtag, the classes are addressed with a dot. So I can say dot main, not main content, main underscore section, right? That's how we called it. And so padding of 16 pixels will be applied to every element that belongs to the class main section. Okay, so if we save this, reload, there we go. We have a bit of padding here. We have a bit of padding here, and we have a bit of padding here, and we have a nice kind of like rhythmic division of the page. Again, aesthetically, not the most elevated choices, but hopefully it kind of conveys the idea of how the CSS allows you to modify your page in different ways. And again, if we go through the responsive options, you will see that on an iPhone, it looks like this, right? The section paddings and the section sort of background color, they all remained. And then if we go switch over to iPad mini, right, you can see how on iPad mini it looks according to the CSS that we've written. And then if we maybe undo the responsive mode, we can see that here's our page. This is what it would look like on a large screen. Okay, so I think one last final thing is just to underscore how useful IDs can be, right? You will see a lot of CSS written through classes. This is kind of like become the standard paradigm, but there's one hidden power of IDs that you can always capture. IDs can also serve as links. So we said that we want to have a long scroll, and when we click on the about or when we click on contact, we want to be scrolled down to that. And this is what you can do with IDs. So we can switch this from about.html to, again, remember IDs are addressed with hashtags, so hashtag about. And then here we can say that the href will be to ID contact, and home will be to the very top of the page, and we can just say like empty ID. So empty ID hashtag will be top of the page, or you can actually specify home, right? Because we have the ID home on this section. Same thing, right? So let's make sure we save this, right? So now our links take us to the IDs instead of external pages, right? So let's save this, reload, and see if it works. Let's click on about. Oh, yes, it does, right? It doesn't have any further to scroll, so about is not at the very top. But if we had more content, it would place it right at the very top. We just don't have enough content, okay? So there we go. This is how CSS can be very helpful. If you want to find out more, I highly recommend that you go and look at some of the details here in the MDN web docs, right? Specifically in CSS styling, the web section, and also look at the website called CSS Tricks, right? It can be very, very helpful, right? So they usually publish very interesting articles about CSS, and they also have various guides that you can look at. And some of them are meant for beginners, some of them are meant for more advanced users. So yeah, and Google is always there. You can find out a lot more about what CSS can do for you just by Googling things and seeing what other people have done with it, right? All right, I think that's it for now. Have some fun with it, enjoy, and I'll see you next time.